Welcome back.
Yeah? Is that how we're doing
intro?
That's
going
our
to be our
intro.
intro. This is how we're beginning.
We're going.
We're back with the Unironic Masterpiece Fanfic Theater, bringing you fan fiction that we think is good.
At the very least, it doesn't suck.
Yay. At any rate, we're back after being off in parts unknown for however long, and we have a new story. Nick, introduce the story.
Today's story is a longtime favorite of myself and Steven's. Today we will be reading and reviewing The Best of Times, a Ranma and Sailor Moon crossover by an author known as Ozzallos, or Ozzallos.
I always thought it was Ozzallos.
As with the last two episodes, I'm Nick. We have Steven and special guest Jesse.
Hi, I'm Jesse.
That's Jesse. So, Steven, would you like to
call
give
him special guest, but we just try to keep him here all the time.
Well, yeah, whatever. Actually, before we get started, we've had a minor update since the last two episodes. The authors of both stories have since reached out to us and acknowledged our existence, which is nice, you know. So we would like to thank both Dark Angelus, author of... door's open. Dark Angelus, author of President for a Day, and one of us got it right apparently last time, but we don't know who. Isavril, author.
Isvaril. If we just say all of them again, we'll get it right at least once.
Yeah. Author of War Games for responding and letting us know what they thought of our reviews and not completely hating us, so that's great. In fact, Dark Angelus has since updated the links on, at least on the fanfiction posting, to her coffee. So there will be a link below in the description, and I will try to remember to put a card up right about now on screen for mobile listeners to, if you would like to, go support the author. That's coffee.com/darkangelus.
Buy her a coffee.
Absolutely. Steven, would you like to give us a brief overview of our grading criteria and maybe the story itself?
Sure thing. I'll go over the grading criteria very quickly, and then actually I think it might be beneficial to just very quickly touch on the source material for this fan fiction.
Especially
it is a crossover.
Yeah, especially since Jesse here is not familiar in the slightest with either of the two source materials involved. Is that right?
What we're doing here,
of Googling.
What we're basically doing here, we've got a rubric that's been written out by yours truly, and we're just going to be using this rubric to grade fan fiction. And the criteria we're looking at are the premise of the story, its consistency with the sources it's pulling from, the plot and the characters, the writing quality and the cleanliness, and we'll go a lot more into detail on that when we get to our final scores. But going into the story itself, today's story, The Best of Times, by Ozzallos, Ozzallos, I don't know. But I'm just going to say Oz because... I'm just going to say Oz because that way at least I can be intentionally incorrect.
Acceptable.
But this is a crossover between Ranma Half, or Ranma 1/2 in other circles, and Sailor Moon. Yay. So Ranma Half is a bit more obscure for some of our listeners, maybe. But basically, it's the original, love dodecahedron romantic comedy story.
Many of you know as the harem genre.
Yes, but it's aware of itself for the most part.
Absolutely.
Which makes it freaking hysterical.
It's pretty great.
And the whole premise of Ranma is Ranma Saotome is a martial artist. Ranma Saotome is also engaged to everyone, and
it's almost exclusively his father's fault.
Yes, but because of this, his life is complicated, and he gets to deal with all manner of chaos. Sailor Moon is a bit more well-known, probably.
Yeah, most likely.
Sailor Moon, they fight evil by moonlight, win love by daylight, never run from a real fight. I think
there's only one named Sailor Moon, but, you know.
Yeah. Anyway, they're a bunch of space princesses that got reincarnated from the distant space past to fight evil in the present and also maybe the future. It gets complicated. I'm sure we'll get more into this as the review goes on.
You know, for the sake of all of us, I hope we don't. There is one thing that you neglected to mention, and that's the 1/2 part of Ranma 1/2. That particular part of the title comes from the character's tendency to change gender when exposed to varying degrees of water. By degrees, I mean temperature, because I forgot the word temperature.
So structured today.
No,
we
absolutely none.
Beyond structured. So, Nick is right. Actually, the biggest part of Ranma half is so many characters have curses that are water-based. Mm-hmm. So cold water turns them into something else, and hot water returns them back to their birth form.
Jesse's just got a big smile on his face.
I just found out there was more than one cursed water person.
Oh yeah, Moose, Shampoo.
There's many of them.
Ranma's dad, Ryoga. They all have curses.
Jesse, you may have been wondering why everybody was interjecting there right at the beginning. There's just a bunch of dialogue, and then the line quack. That's why.
Yeah, that's Moose.
Oh, okay.
As a duck. So here's about the time where we should recommend, if you haven't read the story, feel free. Links are in the description to all the different places that this story is posted that we could find, which I can't remember how many there are off the top of my head, and I'll find that out as I post this.
Just say a random number between 0 and
4.
20.
Pause, go read through. This story, it's 100,000 or so words, so it's longer than the previous 2 stories we've covered, and as a result, we have a completeness bonus that will be applied to the story at the end.
Hooray! So, premise of the actual story. Jesse, tell us what the story is about. I'm interested to hear what you're able to say.
Yes, as am I.
Okay, so Ranma found a magical sword, and while being frustrated because his life is apparent... Also, he's a martial artist, no one mentioned.
Oh yeah, no, he's the world's greatest, apparently.
Yeah.
Which, that's a bit of a liberty that a lot of authors take, but it's based upon the context of the story. He never loses.
He's a savant.
So, at one point, he has a magical wishing sword that apparently people wished for things that weren't possible, so nothing happened. And Ranma, just like without thinking about it, being frustrated about how harem-y his life is,
Yep.
and how nothing can ever go right. He's like, I just don't know why I can't ever get a second of peace. And then he finds out the answer is because Sailor Pluto, Master of Time or something,
Yep.
Who's apparently like 3,000 years old, decides if I let Ranma just run free, 100% of the world will die. But if I just piss him off by making girls like him, then only like 99.9% of the world will die.
And we can save everyone in Crystal Tokyo, but only a few of them. Now, here's going to be one of those points where we get into canon versus fanon, which, it's fan fiction, right? That's going to happen. Sailor Moon in particular has a very large community of people who take what limited information there is on the Silver Millennium or the backstory of Sailor Moon and just completely flesh it out. So,
one thing that is canon is Setsuna's playing the long game.
Yes.
Sailor Pluto is, because really the two things that are meshing from both materials are, one, Sailor Pluto's desire for, quote-unquote, the good future.
Yep.
So, Sailor Pluto is the guardian of time. She sees all that once was and all that will be. But, she is wanting to have the future where they get Crystal Tokyo, which is their utopia that comes after
essentially the apocalypse
and freezes over the earth. And then the Sailor Senshi come and make everything better. But apparently, Ranma's existence is so
chaotic,
volatile, and chaotic that his existence itself, if not sufficiently distracted, completely skews the probability of Crystal Tokyo happening. So Pluto is actually the one who is responsible for Ranma's entire crappy life, because it's all been concocted in an effort to keep him busy enough that he's not making Crystal Tokyo not happen.
Yeah, so if he's entirely focused on keeping himself from A, dying, B, going insane, or C, getting married, then he's not destroying the future.
So our story begins, because this is actually a canon thing that happens in Ranma. The wishing sword gets found by one of the characters, who is unimportant in this story, Kuno, and a couple of wishes get made.
Excuse you, Kuno is very important. Prince R.
In this story, I would say prob's not.
He's really not.
But Ranma gets the sword at the end. I think there's, 3 wishes on the sword,
yes.
And Ranma gets the last one. And in canon, the wish just gets comedically wasted, and that's the punchline. Here, everybody thinks the wish was comedically wasted, but actually, what the wish has done, now that Ranma's asked, why don't I get a second of peace, the wish has interpreted that as, okay, I'm just gonna stuff Setsuna's memories into your head, so that
you now know everything that the Guardian of
question.
Time knows.
Well, not yet. It's very slow.
Yeah, well,
It's a few memories at a time.
You're going to be drip-fed thousands of years of memories over the course of a few weeks.
Most of them are apparently having sex.
There's a lot of them that are just having sex. And that makes Ranma very uncomfortable.
You know,
understandably.
If someone's lived for thousands of years, more than likely,
they've probably had a lot of sex. Yeah,
well,
you're
they
right.
went into the math in it later on, like the last chapter.
Yep.
At any rate, though, that's basically the premise. As for the events of this story, I'm just going to go ahead and give you guys my first impression. And I almost feel bad about this, because I remember really liking this story way back when I first picked it up. I think, I actually know for a fact, because of other details, that Nick is... I told Nick about this story and told him to read it, and told him how to read it.
Yep.
And I won't say I was disappointed, but the story didn't quite hold up as well as I remembered.
There is a bit of nostalgia goggle effect going on, yeah. Absolutely.
I think part of this is one of Oz's older stories. Yeah. Like, this is from freaking 2006, 2005. This is no spring chicken. So, there's a lot of moments like that just sort of show through to me and go, oh, this is an older story. I don't know how you guys felt on that, particularly you, Nick, because you've read this before.
And, you know, I will preface this with there's a lot of nostalgia affecting my review in this case, so it's definitely not an unbiased review. But, and we'll get more in depth with this particular point later. It does suffer from hobbyist beta syndrome, right? Where it would benefit from a professional editor going through and saying, all right, maybe if we change this pacing a little bit here, and if we restructured this paragraph here, but at the same time, again, that's something that we've given a little leeway to in the past. So, you know, it's something to keep in mind. And I think with that out of the way, should we move on to scoring, or is there anything else we wanted to discuss first?
Oh, there's a lot to discuss. Jesse, I just want to know what your thoughts were as someone who is not familiar with Ranma half.
Well,
and is barely familiar with Sailor Moon.
Oh, yeah, I'm not or that weird Neko thing.
Oh, yeah, all cultural cat girl Nuku Nuku.
Oh,
just sort of in there for absolutely no discernible reason except to add those two characters to the final confrontation.
Exactly. They added a girl with the helicopter to shoot things.
It was like a VTOL.
Yeah, it was. No, like, it literally became to a point where, like, anyone with the word sailor in their name, I could differentiate them, and then it would start using their real names. And it was just like, I just kind of, my eyes would
What, you don't know, you can't associate Haruka and Michiru with Uranus and Neptune in your head?
I could barely get Ranma and Ronko to be two different things.
That's because they're not.
Yeah, I know.
They're the same person.
Trying to figure out which one Prince R is.
That's a good point.
I don't even know what a tuxedo mask is. What does he do? He snipes with roses?
With roses, and he fences with a cane.
What does that mean?
He throws roses very fast.
A tuxedo mask is a boy who looks handsome and does nothing.
Okay.
And now I depart. You didn't do
Is everyone from Silver Age Magic Moon World, like, are
the
they
Silver
only
Millennium?
female?
So the Sailor Senshi are.
Okay.
Because they were the princesses of their respective planets.
Basically, anyone other than Sailor Moon, Pluto, and Ranma don't remember who they are.
Good. That's excellent.
Here's something I will say. I think that, because Jesse brought up Nuku Nuku getting tossed in there.
Good.
One of the things I will say, because I have a lot of things to say as we get into scoring.
I'm sure you do.
But I think one of Oz's biggest strengths is just having a feeling for just the chaos that is Ranma half.
Yep, I agree with that.
Because this is very much a Ranma story that has Sailor Moon poking into it.
Well, I mean, it's very much a Ranma story that takes a lot of Ranma Sailor Moon crossovers, and yes, there are a lot of them, have this same sort of feel where it starts off with this wacky sort of chaotic Ranma story that takes a dark turn later on, much like a lot of Sailor Moon stories do.
But
Which
in this case,
is what
it's
makes
also
it
kind of the point.
Yeah, I know, and that's what
the
makes them
premise.
mesh so well.
And I think that's what... Because what I was saying was that Oz's strength is making those chaotic situations. Because the appeal of Ranma is that it's a bunch of kind of selfish, violent people all just sort of getting tossed together. And all of these different variables make for like a primordial soup of chaotic comedy.
Yep.
And Oz has a really good feel for that. And I think really the biggest show of that is just adding Nuku Nuku into the story itself, because that's such a natural fit.
Yeah.
Jesse, just for you, so we're covering this, Ranma has a crippling phobia of felines.
So,
I figured
Ranma
that part out.
So,
when they mentioned it every time there was a cat.
Quick little backstory. When he was a child, his father wrapped him in fish sausages and threw him into a small pit full of very hungry cats to train him in the way of the cat fist. It worked, but it also had the crippling side effect of turning him into a cat every time he's exposed to cats. Like, mentally into a cat.
Okay.
And that's where that comes from. Okay, he says, not really understanding.
Adding the android girl who has a cat's brain is a weirdly natural thing to do.
That's a strange sentence.
For a Ranma half story.
No. If you want something unnatural in this story, it's a perverted old man getting sent to Mount Rushmore, meeting Kid Jiraiya from Naruto for about 10 seconds, and then completely leaving like it never happened.
No, he didn't go to Mount Rushmore. He went to Konoha.
How did I figure that out?
It wasn't Mount Rushmore.
It was mountains with the heads in them.
Which is why he thought he was in America.
Obviously, he's in America.
And that's what he thought, but it
saw
was
Crazy
Konoha.
Horse.
In America. Date bio.
Date bio. So yeah, there is a Naruto crossover for all of 3 paragraphs.
I googled the word Jiraiya to make sure it wasn't out of some other story.
Nope.
Even though it's a popular Japanese tale.
What I think I just want to come down to, before we go into grading, what my general thoughts on the story are, is it's a very funny story. But it's a story primarily for people who like Ranma.
Yeah.
If you are a Ranma fan, you'll probably enjoy this story. If you're a Ranma fan who doesn't know a whole lot about Sailor Moon, you'll probably enjoy this story. If you are a Sailor Moon fan who doesn't know about Ranma,
do some research.
Just keep the wiki open next to you like Jesse always does.
Yep. Oh, no. I googled the names and then clicked on images so I could get a picture of them in my head, and that was it.
Even better.
Okay, so ignore the wiki.
I just needed to know what they looked
like.
But
yeah. That is my surface
I'd like to point out,
recommendation.
After reading this, Jesse went and watched one episode of Ranma. Quite possibly one of the worst episodes of
Episode
Ranma.
like 119.
And his first response was, wow, they all sound like adults. They're absolutely nothing like I imagined their voices in my head.
It's like 80s anime when, like, Yu Yu Hakusho or early Goku, we're all teenagers, we're basically adults. We're now anime is just super anime.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah.
Yep.
Nibiki was not like...
Back when the anime
Nabiki?
was more 80s and then anime.
Nibiki.
Look.
No, you had only read it. You hadn't heard it spoken. I get it.
Ranma.
Renko.
Sailor Moon.
We're getting off track.
Plato!
Scores! I got out of the way what I wanted to say. Do we want to jump into just grading
We
now?
should just jump right into it. Let's go ahead and move on to grading.
Okay. Whoever says I first gets to do their first score.
You already said it.
You did.
Darn it. Okay, so first thing we're looking at is premise.
This is just we're just right
what
on
I
it
said
today.
earlier, despite what I said earlier about some things just not holding up as well as I previously thought they did, I actually gave the premise on this a 10 out of 10. And I mean that, like, very genuinely, Nicholas, as a 10 out of 10. Not like me just being generous. But in one of the author's notes, in one of those latter chapters, Oz mentions that this was sort of done as, like, a challenge to do, like, a fuku-fic that was less traditional. And for the uninitiated, a fuku-fic is a colloquial term in the Ranma/Sailor Moon community, which is basically a fic where the goal is to get Ranma in the sailor costume.
That's exactly what it is. There is an entire forum/website, fukufix.net, I believe, based solely on this concept. It's a great website.
I'm checking for that right now.
Highly recommend.
But he mentions in his author's note how he was just kind of he was trying to come up with something original, and this is what he eventually ended up with, which honestly I think it's a great premise. It's unorthodox in a good way, and it carries humorous situations well, because the premise is someone else is creating the humorous situations. Let's fight back with more humor.
Let's fight the source of the chaos with more chaos.
Basically.
I have an idea. I'm gonna fight the Guardian of Time.
How? I don't know.
Cockroaches?
Yep, that's one man. Jesse, what do you think?
Okay, so...
Oh, wait, Steven, you said you gave it a 10?
Yeah.
I gave it a 10.
All right.
All the characters are exactly like how... No, I have one question. There's literally a paragraph that I really wanted to ask about that's basically like, because all of Ranma's time is being handled basically and bothered, basically all he ever has to do is fight, and so he's gotten really, really good at that, which almost seems counterintuitive, because the next line is like, he's a genius in almost... Like, if he puts his mind to it, he can be a genius in anything. Does that seem right for Ranma?
So, okay, I wanted to touch on this too.
We will get there when we get to source consistency.
Can I actually touch on it real quick?
Say it.
What that was saying is that he's an idiot savant. Like, his mental growth was stunted such that his true mental prowess only comes out when faced with a challenge in the form of a direct challenge, like a fight or an opponent.
Okay.
Right? So when he is in... And this is shown a lot throughout Ranma, like martial arts tea ceremony. Anything that can be construed in any way, shape, or form as a fight is something he excels at.
Okay.
So I get the way that was written, and that's a very common sort of approach to writing Ranma. I really like that. I think it's a bit of a stretch, because there's a lot of situations where Ranma just bashes his head against a wall until he wins. But he does eventually figure it out, and it's usually through some clever plan. So, yeah, I would say that for the most part, that is fairly consistent.
Right.
And I'll probably pitch in a bit more on that when we get to consistency.
Absolutely.
But first, Jesse, what did you think of the premise itself?
I just wanted to touch on that one thing, because I needed to know more about that character. As far as the premise, I actually really liked it. I guess 10, yeah. It's not much.
Yeah.
Just 10. It's fine.
Yeah.
I
don't know enough to be nitpicky about it.
I do.
Yeah.
So, again, Nick, I love this story. I love it. Like, he learned the majority of his troubles are caused by this one being, right? And that's a great way to present, like, kind of reminiscent of, like, Takahashi herself, right? She's the author of Ranma's story. So if you put Pluto in that role, it creates, as Oz describes it, the best pissing match in the galaxy.
To be fair, apparently she didn't do anything until he actually got to Nerima.
Yep.
And everything up to that was just his dad.
Yeah, well, yeah. The only time that the premise sort of felt a little weird is as it connects to the Sailor Moon universe. So it up until later in the story, it doesn't seem to really work as well, because it focuses solely on Setsuna initially, which I like, because it gives her character a little more development, and we'll get to that later. But overall, I gave this premise a 7, because it's a good, solid premise. I have a few small issues where it doesn't quite feel right, but overall, yeah, I really like it.
See, I'd be willing to bet those 3 points you take off, I probably took off for the same reasons somewhere else.
Most likely.
That you didn't take off there.
No.
Because the way I sort of look at that, the premise, I'm not even looking at the story at all. I'm just sort of looking at the inciting idea.
Yeah.
What are we going into? And I think that idea is an excellent idea.
Yeah.
I think just not even looking at the story itself, if I was just ignoring everything that happens, the idea of, okay, Setsuna is causing the chaos in Ranma's life, and Ranma has just figured it out. What's he going to do about it? I think that's a great idea. So that's a 10 out of 10 for premise in my book.
You know, I think you've made a strong argument for my interpretation of this particular story's premise being a bit unfair, as I have in fact judged it based upon the rest of the story. So when you put it that way, I think I would have to revise my score and give it at least a 9, if not a 10. So I'm gonna go ahead and give that a 9 for premise.
Flip a coin.
I think,
if it's heads, it's 10. If it's tails, it's 9.
I think, Steven, you've made a good argument for me increasing my score in this category.
Hooray! I knew that public relations degree was good for something.
Anyway, I have an art degree. I can't talk. I work on cars.
Next up is source consistency.
2 10s and a 9 because I'm Nick. Next, source consistency. Yes, Steven, would you like to lead?
So for source consistency, we're just looking specifically how the fic holds up to the sources themselves. What works, or rather, what holds up compared to the source material. This is one that I was a bit conflicted on, because I think Oz prefers to work with characters who are able to move things forward in the story.
Yeah.
And to be able to decide to do what they want to do effectively. Which I get. It makes it easier to move things forward, to get the plot moving. But, oh my word, I just cannot stand how gosh darn competent all of the characters end up being.
Yeah, okay. I can see that.
Like, you get where I'm coming from, though.
No, I do.
Because it's weird on both ends. Because, like, on the Ranma end, for me, it's the way that decisions are made. Ranma is really decisive in this fic, which is something that Ranma has never been.
Okay.
That's basically the whole premise of Ranma's story. He has so many girls to choose from and cannot pick one of them. And then on the Sailor Moon end, it's just kind of like... But to me, the core appeal of Sailor Moon is that they're space princesses who are, like, protecting the world and fighting evil, but whatever. But they're also, like, kids in high school, and they act like it.
Yeah.
And
they make stupid, rash, impulsive decisions based on the moment rather than the long term.
This story kind of, it feels like it forgets that at some point. There's, like, one point where, like, Usagi, like, wields some authority, Sailor Moon does, in, like, a very un-Sailor Moon way. And I think part of that is because, and this is another thing from the author's note, Oz basically comes straight up and says in that author's note, at this time, I had no clue about anything from Sailor Moon, so basically everything that I know is, like, from conversations that I had with other people while I was writing this story, which explains it to me. It doesn't justify it, but it explains it to me. And because of things like that, I had to give it a 6 out of 10, just for lack of consistency in those characters.
I thought source consistency was a 15-point category.
Nope. It's premises for 10 points. Oh, you're right. Source consistency is for 15 points. Well, find me in the outs.
I mean, 6 out of 10 would be a 12 out of 15.
So. Kicked off the show.
Well, I'm going to immediately
it'd be a 9
revise my
out of
score.
15, sorry.
We're bumping that up to, correct, 9 out of 15. My problems with it were mostly with the characters and the way they conducted themselves. As for the other sources, like Nuku Nuku, I don't really know enough about that to complain about it. But I thought they were fine for what I knew. But that's just sort of where I come down on it. I might actually lower that a bit retroactively and come down to a final score while you two decide or discuss yours, I should say.
So, when you said that you probably removed points in other places that I removed in premise, I think I pulled points out of plot and characters that you may have pulled out of source consistency. I looked at source consistency as more of an overall world, and those characters acting within that world. So with a crossover, I'm more inclined to give it a little more leeway with regards to source consistency, because you're having these characters act slightly, at least in this case, where the Sailor Moon and Ranma worlds are so sort of similar that they can mesh pretty well. They're acting reasonably within their own world, but with consideration for the other world that's being involved. So I don't know if that makes any sense, or if that was just absolute word vomit.
No, and I get what you're saying. I think for me, the issue is I know it can be done better because I've seen it done better.
Okay, and yeah, I'll give you that.
I don't want to compromise just because I know this is from 2005. But for me, the way I look at it, source consistency is how consistent are we with square one.
Yeah.
Because I think you can have characters grow in your fanfiction. You can have a character grow away from their established arc and characters.
Yep.
And that's what I would consider in the plot/character section. But for source consistency, I would want the characters, at least at the beginning, to be recognizable. And for the most part, they are. But there are a lot of things that just make me go, that's a little OOC. That's a little out of character for that character.
Out of character!
And those are the things that that pull me out of it. That's sort of what my complaint is.
So with my particular grading, like I said, I mean, overall, this really just felt to me a lot like the extended Ranma movies or the extended OVAs. It very much felt like these characters did exist within character in these scenarios. It felt not real. It felt right for the most part. Yeah, there were a few points where someone would say or do something, and like you said, Ranma's decisiveness was a little odd, but I thought it was pretty damn consistent for the most part, at least on the Ranma end. The Sailor Moon stuff, yeah, I can see how that could be a little but even like when Usagi does whip out that authority and say, no, we're doing this my way right now, it does kind of make sense, because there are a lot of points throughout Sailor Moon where she becomes even if for a short time, a much more mature individual, and that's a big part of her character's growth from the beginning of the series to the end. Even if she does retain that sort of clumsy, awkward sort of... Huh?
There's no room to argue with you on that.
Yeah. So I gave it a 13 out of 15 for source consistency. I took off those 2 points for a couple of small incidents here and there, but overall I thought it was very consistent and very easy to keep myself in the headspace for these two stories.
I think what it came down to for me was not what she did, but the way she did it didn't quite feel right.
And I can see that.
I think the events of the story follow through, and we'll get to that with plot and characters. But to me, it's just sort of like the characters themselves, particularly because this story is mostly centered around Ranma and the Sailor Moon cast.
Yes.
The rest of the Ranma cast doesn't really have a whole lot to do. I guess Ukyo gets to be like a fancy ornament at some point.
Yeah, and Ryoga gets to come help out in the fight, and you know it's like a lot of the characters from Ranma, when he needed their help, were there to help him, whether it was for their own selfish reasons or not. They were there. Like the Saffron fight,
and
the
I don't
entire
have a problem
Phoenix
with that
King
either.
Huh?
I don't have a problem with that either. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. So even if it was a little pandery with the meet the Narama Wrecking Crew argument, or that one moment right there, that's 100% a fan name,
fan
right?
service.
And I get it. It's fine. I enjoy it because it's fan service targeted at me.
I mean, I will say I did try to control myself. Gonna be honest. Like, I've said this to you before, Nick. Ukyo may be best girl, but Ranma Nakane is OTP.
Disagree.
I try not to let my pairing opinions influence the way I view other people's pairings and their stories.
What was it? Was it Black Dragon that said, yeah, there's a lot of Akane bashing in this story, that's because I don't like or deal with it?
Basically. And honestly, if someone's going to come out and say that, I'll be like, yeah, sure, I'll take that.
At one point, Oz even wrote that, like, he didn't like Akane, but knew that he had to write her or something like that.
Because he was trying to stay relatively consistent with the source, because that's how they're written. Jesse, what's your opinion on the source consistency of The Best of Times, a Ranma/Sailor Moon crossover fanfiction?
Well, those 3 paragraphs when Jiraiya was in there with Mount Rushmore seemed pretty consistent with him just being a pervert and not caring about people teleporting randomly like that time.
But Jesse, don't you want to be the ninja president and have your face carved on Mount Rushmore?
Just like my dad and grandpa before me.
JFK Sensei, is your face gonna be on the mountain next?
Oh yeah, that's why Kakashi always wears the mask.
It's anyway. So
He lost
I mean,
to
I
a
know
ninja whose special technique allowed him to curve bullets.
He used the shadow clone jutsu to hide in the grassy knoll.
From my no knowledge, I'm just gonna give it full points.
Full points.
Yeah.
Oh boy. 15 points from Jesse. And that
Jesse picked up no problems. Jesse found no inconsistencies.
with these parts.
Steven, if only The Battle Never Ends was a hell of a lot shorter. Because then we'd have some stuff for Jesse to be real knowledgeable on. It's a Naruto Metal Gear crossover.
Oh man, I thought you were gonna say One Piece, but that's even better.
It's got lemons in it, and they're really, really bad.
How's a lemon?
You know what? Maybe
a lemon
maybe
is a sex
we should
scene.
pull that one out.
Maybe we should pull it out. Okay, at some point, maybe in the future.
We'll keep it in mind. Oh,
No
okay.
completeness
Source
bonus for that
consistency
one.
is
It
done.
never ends.
Okay. I've amended my source consistency bonus to what I believe is my final score.
Okay.
I've got that down for an 8 out of 15.
Okay, I'll make a note of that when I'm editing. All right.
And
I think that rounds out our source consistency discussion. On to plot and characters. Steven.
So my score on this, I came down to 30 out of 40.
Okay.
I think because the plot, I'll just sort of read the synopsis I put here. Plot goes, Sailor Pluto has been causing all the chaos in Ranma's life. Now Ranma's out for payback, and after a wish from the wishing sword, a la canon, he begins basically sort of trying to get back at Pluto in whatever way he can. And he utilizes the fact that he is apparently invisible to Pluto's time gate shenanigans to start pranking her hardcore, and also puts together like a weird Senshi disguise to get closer to her and maybe sabotage her standing with Usagi, Sailor Moon. But then there turns out to be like a bigger Yoma threat, and then it involves some heroic sacrifice, and then an ending happens.
An ending does happen, and only one.
But that being said, I think the plot is pretty fun. It's primarily comedy with some drama, and I think the comedy tends to work a lot better than the drama in this case. Like I said before, I think Oz has a real knack for understanding just sort of the chaotic circumstances
I agree.
of Ranma and how tossing everything together, because that's kind of the Ranma philosophy of humor. You have a bunch of different variables and you just throw them together in different amounts and mixtures, and you get different kinds of humor pretty consistently almost every time. And like Nuku in particular is a great amusing addition to that, because she pushes Ranma's buttons in just the right way, and she's also sort of got the clout to hold herself. What I think I sort of have the issue with comes with the drama parts, which sort of feel forced to me. Not incredibly forced, but those parts are a bit weaker than the humor itself.
Yeah.
Because the humor seems to be the point of the story to me, and that's where it really hits home.
The
But then,
drama feels like it exists to set up for the humor. Like, to set up situations where humor can happen.
Yeah.
It is not in itself the driving force behind the story.
The other thing that kind of made me want to sort of take some things out is just sort of the random Yoma threat that they have to deal with is sort of there to, like, be the larger third threat that pushes our mutual enemies together and set aside their differences. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily bad.
No, I mean, it's sort of a basic storytelling structure.
It's sort of one of those things where, because the primary focus of this was the conflict between Ranma and sort of Pluto and the Senshi, if it were me personally, I would have made the decision for that to be a larger focus of the climax itself. But what is there is perfectly workable and perfectly serviceable. As for the ending, and let's go ahead and just get this out of the way right now. There are two endings to this. And
yes,
from what I understand, the first ending in the story itself is, we'll call it...
the true ending.
Ending... I was going to say ending A, and I was going to call the other one ending 2.
Ah, acceptable.
I can do that.
But ending A is a bit... I really like ending A.
I do too. I like it a lot.
This one is very tidy, because what happens at the end of this big climactic battle is, like, there's a big explosion and some heroic sacrifice, and everybody thinks that Ranma and Setsuna are dead.
Yep. Well, and it's especially poignant because Ranma is holding off these Yoma while Setsuna is keeping this portal open so that all the gathered forces can escape this other dimension where this bomb is about to go off and kill everything. And at the very last second, Setsuna realizes, I could either leave and leave him behind, or I can stay here and try and help him, and we will probably both die. And she makes that decision in that moment to stay and try and help.
Because I think that's really satisfying. I think Setsuna's arc is very satisfying.
I think it's one of the best, most satisfying parts of the story.
Setting their differences aside, I think Ranma is a bit less so, if only because, like, his development for this seems to maybe occur a bit more off-screen.
Yeah.
But what happens here is, like, everybody thinks that they're dead for a couple of months, and then they just show up again, and apparently they got shifted off to a couple of other timelines.
If you've ever watched Sliders, it's just like that. Who has watched Sliders but me?
Because apparently they've been gone for decades.
20 years.
And
almost.
Time,
it was like 21 years, I think.
They've buried the hatchet. They've gotten hitched. They've had a couple of kids. Yep. And it's very tidy because it sort of resolves everything. It ties a bow on everything. It feels very consistent with, even with the technically not ending Ranma, because Ranma ends, but it ends unresolved technically.
It does. Yep. It ends unresolved because I feel like an unresolved ending is the only way that can end, because that's just the state of the story.
And even with that, though, this ending still feels very consistent to Ranma, in my opinion. Everybody's feelings gets hurt because, they all wanted Ranma, but Ranma's able to... Because there is some growth that occurs off screen, and Ranma comes to terms with himself/herself. He becomes a lot more mature.
Yep.
And he's got a wife and kids now.
And a big part of that Ranma-esque ending is, now there's 3 more. 3 kids. What could happen? And that... I mean, it's implied that, that's exactly what's going to happen. It's going to continue the story, but with Ranma's kids.
And it just moves straight on there, and it, like you said, it feels natural. Mm-hmm. It is a fit for both Ranma and to an extent to Sailor Moon too. Mm-hmm. That being said,
these characters, again, even in Sailor Moon, people die and come back multiple times. Like that's a consistent theme. Death happens, but it's rarely permanent.
As is with anime.
Yep.
But ending 2 I am, because I'll be basing my score off of ending as Nick has instructed me to. Ending 2, I am decidedly less enamored with. So some backstory on this. I read this story back in high school, years ago. Like 8 years ago?
Yeah.
Gee willikers, Nick. But,
Gee willikers!
I say that a lot now, and I don't know why. Gee willikers,
That was the worst high five ever!
No, I was laughing. Stop. It's fine.
It's fine. Move on.
But I had read this story. I read the first ending. I was so happy with it. And I read the second ending, and I was so mad at it. I was so mad at it. Even though it didn't have any impact on anything, it still affected me profoundly to this day. And even older and wiser.
To Oz's credit, the fact that second ending can do that, even after reading the first one and knowing, yeah, this is the actual ending, but I also wrote this ending, that means it's written really well.
Well, because so first detailing what ending 2 even is. In this ending, Setsuna actually dies. Ranma gets, tossed into the gates of time. And then, over the course of however long it takes, the rest of Setsuna's memories get pushed into Ranma's head. And Ranma becomes Setsuna, basically.
Yep.
Also, Sailor Moon's daughter from the future, because Setsuna is dead, her timeline is borked now.
Yep.
And she gets cut off from that timeline. Yep. And she gets all sad and depressed.
Yep.
And then Ranma shows up and explains everything, but doesn't explain anything.
No, nothing.
And then Chibi Usa turns into her sexy girlfriend, and then Hotaru also turns into a sexy woman.
Yep.
Ukyo also goes with them, and then they go to an expensive hotel and have, a threesome, I guess.
Excuse me, that's 4 people.
Well, I don't know if Ukyo participated or not.
I don't know.
I mean, knowing the kind of story this is, probably. But what it gets down to Temple for me, that's exactly what it is, though.
Yeah.
It's literally what I put down in my notes is it's just too Josh Temple for me.
So, Jesse, have we explained what that means?
Nope.
Steven, would you like to?
Josh Temple is I haven't followed
talented.
him in a long time.
He's talented.
He is one of the most prolific fanfic writers in the Ranma community, specifically in the Fukufic community.
The man has a very good grasp of quality writing.
Nick and I don't care for his stories, but he wouldn't have the following he has if he didn't, have the writing chops to back it up. That being said, his stories are 1, primarily Fukufics, and 2 are primarily devoted to ripping apart the character of Ranma gradually and replacing him with someone else.
Yeah.
And usually there's I'm trying to be
there's kink stuff involved.
It's very fetishistic.
Yep, incredibly so.
It's very kinky a lot of the time. I was just telling someone else who I was telling about this just to help me write my review. I was saying there's one of his stories where Ranma turns into a Canadian succubus.
I don't think I've read that. I don't think I want to.
I read a lot of it, and because there are compelling elements to it. It's got a military organization that fights supernatural forces.
Hell yeah.
But Russell Crowe isn't there.
Are we still discussing the plot and characters of the Best of Times right now? Because I don't think we are. I think we might have gone off the...
point of this
there is a military.
I think we might have lost the plot, so to speak.
Josh Temple is someone who does things like this. He takes Ranma, turns him into a completely different character, him/her, and then we get something now we have also turned other characters into something completely different.
And this is not something that is new to Oz either. Kunoification.
Well, Kunoification works because
Does it?
And I want to say
Kunoification
really? Was written after this because the challenge of Kunoification was to try to write a Ranma Kuno story that actually, like, made a functioning pairing that didn't do anything, like, underhanded.
So, anyway...
Yeah, we're getting off topic again.
Yeah.
The thing I wanted to say is what I don't like about what I don't like about ending 2 is, for one, it feels inconsistent with the rest of the story. And I think this is something Oz may have realized because, again, looking back at the author's notes, and I don't know if you two sort of got this vibe too, but it sounds like ending 2 was actually written first.
Yep.
And that was the original intended ending. But then I feel like at some point...
somebody might have pointed out that it didn't quite work.
Well, I think it may have just been him as he was writing the story, figuring out, that's not quite where this feels like it should go.
Yeah.
Because, for one, ending A feels like it's foreshadowed a lot better in the story itself.
Yeah.
Because there's, like, a conversation Ranma has with Chibi Usa that sort of alludes to ending A. And I feel like it's also intended to be sort of the one that is canon.
Yeah,
because
that's
the one
do
that's
discuss
formatted first.
Well, it's not even that. It's she basically outright tells him that ending A is going to happen.
Yeah.
You know, Uncle Ranma. Like...
yeah.
It's not even, like, vaguely foreshadowed. It's directly foreshadowed.
Yes, it's very, very heavy-handed. But at the same time, that's why I think ending 2 was the intention. And then ending A was what ended up feeling right. And I think he'd already sort of had ending 2 and decided he wanted to at least write it out. But that's why both endings are there.
Maybe. I don't know. I can't really... It'd be interesting to get his perspective on it. But, yeah, I don't know if I could really speak for that.
Anyway, that's been a pretty detailed discussion.
It has. So
characters.
You said you gave
At
it
that point, I can just give my
40?
score, which is 30 out of 40. Yes.
Noted. Yeah, I mentioned earlier, it does follow a lot of similar sort of story progression that Ranma fics tend to. Like Ranma, he's got this super genius computer brain when it comes to martial arts, but everything else, he's kind of an idiot. And to an extent, you know, that's sort of played with a lot. But yeah, you know, the decision making, the lack of the lack of chaos within the character, sort of projecting him as the calm eye in the middle of this storm, doesn't really fit perfectly, but it works for the sake of the story. You know, Akane's her usual fanfic self. She's overly violent, violently brutal, few redeeming qualities. Ryoga. I mean, it doesn't get a whole lot of screen time, much like most of the cast. And again, you mentioned before that it's basically Ranma and the sailors. And with the exception of one or two moments that I've already explained why I sort of feel like they fit in with Sailor Moon's character, I think the least consistent character-wise thing is Setsuna, but only because her character in the anime and mangas doesn't have a lot of depth to it. And we get to explore a lot of Oz's interpretation of this character that still seems to fit within the basic outline of the character as given to us by the creator. So
honestly, I completely agree with that.
Plot-wise, the drama stuff you mentioned earlier, I think my biggest issue with it is kind of meanders a bit, you know? Takes a while for it to actually finally get around to where it's trying to be. I feel like maybe there was an intention to add a little more comedy in the end, and he either ran out of time or ran out of interest, or just decided he wanted to end it.
I think... did you get the feeling like this story was just a little overcrowded at times?
Yes.
And I think part of that is... because that's sort of good and sort of bad. Because, like we've been saying, that's sort of the appeal of the humor. Mm-hmm. But there's just so much of it, and there's so much going on, it's easy to get lost.
So, I'm not saying that it was a bad decision to end it where it ended. I think that taking it even further potentially could have been good, but more likely would have just dragged it on more. And, you know, otherwise, it did kind of feel a little anticlimactic right up until the end there, because everything sort of rushed out right at the last second. But I still enjoyed it. So I also gave it a 30 out of 40.
Jesse.
Sorry, I was making sure no one's going to say anything. So I don't have really anything to say about the characters, but as far as the plot goes, which you guys have basically mentioned, a lot of the plot would seem to just kind of drag out for a while, for like 10, 20 paragraphs, and then within like 2 paragraphs everything would get solved, and then it would do that again. Which might be more of quality. I don't know. I think it would be plot.
I think that goes for plot. That's progression.
Just contrivances.
Pacing.
Do I hear a JoJo?
Especially because that Latin that's exactly but that's exactly like ending A was like you would just get paragraph after paragraph of like hints of what happened. Not very subtle hints at all, but constantly, and then with it after it was like literally like 15 paragraphs of them constantly being like, oh, time shenanigans, oh, we have old kids now, but we're not going to explain it yet, and then like 2 paragraphs they just explain
they just tell you what happened.
Oh, it's just such a drag to get there, and like
Nick,
that was probably the most
me a favor?
egregious. What's up?
Can you do me a favor, Nick?
What?
He has to
just pet your dog.
Oh, Jojo, come here.
Dog.
Come here, Jojo. Oh yeah. If you haven't figured it out by now, Jesse and I are in the same room. Steven is recording remotely from his home. Hey, Jojo. Hey, Bob.
So, just because I don't know much about characters, I'm just gonna say 35 out of 40.
35 from Jesse.
Yeah.
35.
Okay. On to quality, friends.
Okay, this time I will not start. This time I'm going to go ahead and tell Jesse to start with his writing quality score.
Out of 25?
So, there were only a few, like... Oh, man. So I wrote them down because they, like, in the first few not paragraphs, but chapters, it really threw me off. for no reason other than the fact that, like, there were some colloquialisms that I feel like the writer just genuinely... doesn't
Jesse's
know
looking
about.
for his notes, please.
I'm
please
really
hold.
good at using a phone. Instead of nowadays, it was now and days.
Yep.
Or like went off without a hitch. It was off it out a hitch.
I think those are times when it's like it might be like Nick was saying earlier. Sometimes you need a beta and you just don't have one.
And that's one of those things where, like, when people write should have, and they write should of instead of the contraction.
Right. No, it didn't bother me. It was just, and honestly, it actually, like, it was only the first couple chapters where like, colloquialisms got messed up. I was almost hoping it happened more, like a bad anime or something. But it didn't, which honestly makes me sad.
I'm disappointed that your quality improved.
It actually got, like, much better. Well, especially because, like, I just started reading it way faster at some point. Because it was really long, and I don't read ever. So, out of 25, I'm just say 23.
Okay.
Because there were still a few mistakes here and there, but it was honestly beautiful to read.
So, I honestly, Jesse summed it up pretty perfectly. Early on, there were a few small issues I had, but overall, it was well written, well thought out, well structured. Oz is a very experienced writer, clearly, who seems to have benefited a lot from his time on various fan sites and fan fiction posting sites. And through these conversations he's had with other authors, has learned a lot about how to properly write and structure his stories. So I gave it a 22 out of 25 because of some of those early issues, but for the most part, I really liked it.
What was your score?
22.
22. I actually gave it a 21, so just one underneath that.
That's where the few points were different.
That's where those few points were.
I think Oz does well with just a few errors in punctuation, spelling, and grammar. And honestly, I don't take anything off for those. What I really take off for is actually the action. I don't know if you felt this way, but particularly in that last big action sequence, there were just walls of text that I would be reading through, and I would just kind of find myself nodding off a little bit, maybe just sort of my eyes glossing over everything as I was reading through. And it wasn't bad. Like, I could still read it, and for the most part I could tell what was happening. but it felt like it was just going on and it wasn't catching me. I found myself a lot more invested in the parts where things were dialogue heavy, where things were humor, joke heavy, but that big action bit at the end was a bit harder to get through for me. So that's why I took that down to a 21.
I can see that.
Yeah, I completely agree that like the dialogue was easily the best part.
Oh, for sure. And like the planning and figuring out what to do and waiting for the results of his stupid pranks and stuff. Those were easily the most enjoyable parts.
Especially like never really explaining it and just going to like giving a few hints and then just showing it.
And then it happens. Yeah, show don't tell.
It's great.
It's like the standard anime adage of the less the audience knows about a plan, the more likely it is to work.
Precisely.
It's how you always know who's gonna win in a gambling anime. They're the person you don't hear the inner dialogue for.
Okay, so we've given it pretty high marks on writing quality, I think, for the most part. Cleanliness. Here's a good one. I'll start on this one. Very clean, easy to read, good flow from sentence to sentence and paragraph to paragraph. Occasional small spelling and grammatical mistake that can be easily attributed to our favorite culprit here, the hobbyist beta, or lack thereof. I gave it a 9 out of 10.
Or, just fanfiction.net being
fanfiction.net and its formatting nightmares. Which is
WordPress,
where we were reading this particular story.
In WordPress, we throw sideways glances and say that we trust it out the side of our mouths.
What about you, Jesse? What do you think?
So honestly, it was beautiful paragraphs, line breaks when it decided to cut from scene to scene. Looked all fine to me, so I'm just going to give it full marks.
That's an easy 10 from Jesse. 43 points. That's a 10 out of 43.
Other way around. It would be 43 out of 10.
Oh, my bad.
Yeah.
Steven.
I gave it full marks, too. For
Excellent.
me, cleanliness is... Because the reason when I put this rubric together, I put cleanliness and writing quality separate, is... And I bring this up every time, but it was just my experience of reading like 30,000 word fics that had been formatted like on one line on a .txt document.
Yeah. Or when it's written in HTML and they just directly copy it over.
Oh, that's horrible.
Or back when script fics were a thing.
Ooh.
But here, everything... Cause for me, cleanliness is less about quality and more about quality of life, about conveying information properly. Everything was conveyed right here. I didn't see anything that made me like raise my eyebrows that wasn't from the story itself.
Right.
So I give that full 10 out of 10.
Fantastic. So next we have our completeness bonus, which first time here being applied. Easy 5 points. The story's over 100,000 words long. Our benchmark for completeness is 50,000 multiple chapters. So that's a bonus 5 points on top of everything else right out the gate. Easy, no problems, ready to go.
I should elaborate.
On to final
50,000 words, and then either complete or showing recent signs of not being dead.
Yours.
I've got my final score when you guys do.
All right, we'll start with Jesse's. That's a 98 from Jesse. That's a good score.
Wow, Jesse.
All right, Steven.
You really couldn't find any inconsistencies, could you?
Cut out 5 points from the completeness bonus. His base score would have been a 93.
My score came up to an 84.
Okay.
Which...
Is that before or after
still pretty good,
completeness?
honestly. That's after completeness.
Really? Okay.
It came down to a 79 first, then completeness bonus added in. I had that at an 84.
And for once, I don't have the lowest score. I gave it an 88 out of 100.
Suck it, Steven.
Yes, Steven. Fuck you.
One day I'll have to get the lowest score.
I would like to
you
point
both.
out, I got a heartfelt fuck you from Dark Angelus. We love you. Thank you so much. I got a big laugh out of that. I appreciate it.
See, it took all of my self-control, because if I was really grading this off of like the true feelings that I feel for ending 2, I would have given it like a 70.
Ending 2, I think the reason it's important to judge it based on ending 1 ending A, my bad, is because that's the ending that Oz has decided is the one that should come after the story.
Yeah, and honestly, if anything, I would have prepared 2 scores and been like, this is the score with this ending, this is the score with that ending. Mm-hmm. But I think, and I was discussing this with my wife beforehand, I think what it kind of comes down to me is that I think the reason that second ending and like temple stuff in particular doesn't mesh with me is it's very contrary to the tone of the source material.
Yeah.
Because how do I put this? Loss of innocence is definitely a thing that can happen.
Yep.
But because one of our favorite stories, Nick, the Dark Lords trilogy,
yes,
is basically all about that, and it does it wonderfully.
The Dark Lords trilogy,
by
the way, is written by an author named Claymade. It's the Dark Lords of Narima, the Dark Lords Strike Back, and the Dark Lords Ascendant. Fantastic story, updates consistently 2 or 3 times a year. Incredibly well written, incredibly well structured. Highly recommend. I hope one day we can cover it on here, but as of right now, it is currently longer than the Harry Potter series. So,
oh yes,
we might get to that eventually, but that's a ways off.
I've got some ideas for what we might do next, and it might be a little experimental. But what I was saying was that I think there's a difference between loss of innocence and just pretending like innocence was never there to begin with.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's kind of what grinds my gears, what gets my goats, what apples my jacks about Josh Temple stuff, about ending 2. It just rubs me the wrong way in like this primal way I can't explain.
Sandpaper.
It's I feel like a soldier on the front lines of the first waifu wars.
Oh no.
It's so weird, but I'm just so violently opposed to that ending. And it's hard to put into words.
I am too. It's okay. If it tells you anything about me, and I mentioned this to Jesse before, I've read this story 24 times probably. It's a personal favorite of mine. And despite having read ending 2 at least half of those times, I still don't remember anything about it until someone starts talking about it, usually you. And then it all comes back. I think I just repress it.
See,
it hits me like a World War, like a Vietnam flashback.
I'm glad we're not going over it, 'cause I read the first third of it.
That's fine.
The thing that really kills me about this, because I think part of my issue with this story that would probably be pretty quickly resolved is if the Sailor Moon characters were more in character. And that's a problem that's partly just because Oz is admittedly just not familiar with the source material at this time. And I'm just looking at his profile page right now, like a year later, he puts up, like a year and a half later, we get Heir to the Empire.
Another story I
like
a lot.
Another Oz story that has a very similar vibe to it.
It takes a different route with the premise. From the start.
It's a very different premise, but it works better because it feels like, and this is just me saying this off the cuff from memory because I haven't read that story in a long time.
I reread it like a month ago.
I recall that story just feeling a bit better because it feels like he's a bit more familiar, a bit more comfortable with those characters.
Yes. Well, and again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about authors taking liberties with the Silver Millennium stuff. He seems more familiar, at least, with what is considered acceptable versus unacceptable in the fan community around that area.
Yeah.
And he definitely explores that a lot more in depth.
Moreover, Heir to the Empire has the single best punchline to a joke.
It does.
In any Ranma fanfic.
And it is entirely centered around my favorite character in Ranma, Ryoga. And I can't... if you haven't... If you've made it this far and you're looking for another recommendation, please read Heir to the Empire. I love that story for that reason that Steven is discussing right now.
If for some reason you were unfamiliar with everything we just spent the last 65, 70 minutes talking about,
crazy,
and you decided to read that story and you enjoyed the best of times, try out Heir to the Empire by the same author. I think
you will be pleasantly surprised. It is fantastic.
It is a story from the same person, but a bit more experienced. And I think... I don't even want to go and say better. I just want to say it's a bit more of an experienced story. I think it's just the best way to put it.
Yeah. Well, I think we've said most of what needed to be said about the best of times.
Yeah, I got nothing else.
Once again, thank you very much for joining us on the Unironic Masterpiece Fanfic Theater.
It was the best of times. It was
Links can be found in the description below to Ozzallos' posts, not his posts, Ozzallos accounts on any websites I can find, AO3. I believe he's on Space Battles, I know he's on Fukufix, and fanfiction.net. And once again, if you would like to donate to the author from our first episode, Dark Angelus, her coffee is listed below as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Peace.
Goodbye.